Hey there, explorers! Welcome to our channel. Through lens of an Asian today, we will let you dive into the remarkable story of Singapore that no one ever told you before. So, what kind of country is Singapore? If we say that Qatar is a small country, then Singapore is just a grain of rice on the global map due to its tiny size of just over 700 square kilometers, merely 1/15 the size of Qatar, and even smaller than half of Los Angeles, California. However, despite its diminutive stature in terms of land area, Singapore stands as one of the most developed nations globally, boasting a population exceeding 5 million and a GDP per capita potentially exceeding $80,000. In fact, in 2022, Singapore ranked among the top 10 nations globally for GDP per capita. What is truly fascinating is Singapore's economic success, despite its lack of significant natural resources, unlike countries such as Qatar. Let us open the map, you'll understand right away.
The secret lies in its strategic location at the heart of the Malacca Strait, one of the world's busiest waterways. This pivotal position makes Singapore a crucial hub for trade and commerce, serving as a vital transit point for goods and ships travelling between Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. Despite being a small nation, Singapore has managed to thrive and assert its independence, avoiding annexation by larger neighbouring countries, a feat often described as miraculous. Its success story is one of resilience, adaptability, and strategic positioning. Historically, relationship between Singapore and China has been significant, with approximately 74% of its population being of Chinese descent. This cultural connection underscores Singapore's development journey, which can be likened to China's daughter who has been married off. She was forced to navigate challenges and forge her own path. Singapore never thought about independence until British came. Until the early 19th century, the British arrived. Recognizing the strategic location of Singapore, they aimed to reclaim it and establish a colony here. Their intentions weren't limited to establishing a military base, they boldly began developing infrastructure. In the meanwhile, China's 100 Days reform had failed, leaving no choice but to flee the homeland. There were three options: to the west, to the east, or to stay in the Southern Ocean. Among them, heading south meant going to countries in the Southeast Asian region. The British built Singapore well, making it our first choice destination. Due to its geographical location, the British built many banks here, creating a bustling port and attracting many overseas Chinese. Wealthy businessmen gathered here. Singapore seems like Chinese's country at that time, as either during the 1898 reform movement or during the later war against Japan, significant financial support was provided to China by Singapore. However, this was also a reason why Singapore brought disaster upon itself. During World War II, Japan launched the Pacific War, with Singapore as its primary target. The British had military bases there and were capable of fighting, but before they could strike, they were directly attacked and forced to retreat. Japan occupied Singapore effortlessly. The Japanese had oppressed Singaporeans for a long time to send money to China every day to support Japan's military in China. It must be said that these Japanese were truly inhumane, as nearly 100,000 Chinese Singaporeans were massacred. When World War II ended, the British returned and once again took over Singapore. By then, Singapore understood that these British couldn't be trusted and they would fight for independence. During the 1950s and 1960s, the wave of independence swept through Southeast Asia. Singapore also declared independence. However, at that time, Singapore couldn't bear the burden. It couldn't provide food or fresh water on its own. What should it do? It needed a support, a big brother. During this period, Malaysia seemed promising. Among the small countries around, they formed the Federation of Malaysia. But Malaysia didn't have good intentions. They were just swindling money from Singapore. They were demanding 40% tax, which later increased to 60%. Despite this, Singapore endured. Why were the Malaysians unhappy? Because the president of Singapore during this era, Lee Kuan Yew, had a very high reputation and had found a way to boost the economy. Plus, many Chinese Malaysians were willing to support this Chinese leader. Lee Kuan Yew's call for integrity in Malaysia grew more significantly, displeasing the Malaysian Prime Minister, who only sought to make money. As a result, Singapore rose to become the independent girl, leaving Malaysia feeling humiliated, directly cutting off ties with Singapore. At this point in time, Singapore was at a loss, not knowing how to survive. Tears flowed like rivers, crying day and night until there were no tears left. Singapore was truly in a difficult situation at that time, unable to rely on anyone. They had to rely on themselves. Singapore said to the British, "I will follow the British for a while. Help me, please." The British took pity and helped Singapore join the Alliance of British Commonwealth, a political association of 54 member states, most of which are former territories of the British Empire. This alliance allowed Singapore to receive support and protection from the British and other member states. Thus, Singapore's security issue was resolved. The second issue was food. They had to buy it themselves. This large restaurant in Singapore officially opened for business. After all, Singapore was located on a major shipping route. Ships passed through endlessly, so there was no need to worry about business. But there were many competitors, Malaysia and Indonesia. All had to go through Singapore. How could they miss this business opportunity? Lee Kuan Yew, who managed Singapore's treasury at the time, was a bit courageous. His strategy was that Singapore had to be a service-oriented economy. Therefore, to be the winner, they proposed a service with low prices but high quality. Taking this reputation abroad was just a matter of time. They reclaimed all business activities from surrounding countries. The second step was to beautify the interior. They couldn't just keep the money they earned, they had to reinvest it all, building parks and modern infrastructure in the city. Now it looks like a revolutionary architectural step. The third step was to establish rules. Those who were not strict would not stand firm. Singapore's law enforcement had to be extremely strict. Littering, spitting indiscriminately would result in fines. Do you know that beating is still applied in Singapore? It's a specialised tool used to deal with those who repeated their criminals or those who commit death penalty result. They use a cane dipped in freezing water before striking to make it the most hurting. The people who administer this punishment usually weigh over 100 kg. It makes you hurt but doesn't leave any wounds on the outside. You don't need 3 strokes. If your physical condition isn't good, you can't even bear 1 stroke. In Singapore, if you commit a crime, they don't care whether you're a local or a foreigner. Everyone is treated the same. In 1993, there was a foolish American guy who did a lot of illegal things in Singapore, can-listed as spitting, vandalizing, even damaging public property. He was caught red-handed but refused to admit guilt, even when faced with a $2,000 fine, 8 months imprisonment, and 12 strokes of the cane. This news shook the entire United States, and they even intervened to reduce the punishment. As United States is being a big country, Singapore accepted to reduce the punishment from 12 strokes to 4. But even 4 strokes were unbearable for him. His physical condition looked fine. No one could imagine that he fainted after just 2 strokes. To avoid a death from a foreigner, Singapore provided him with the best medical treatment, and the remaining 2 strokes would be administered once he recovered. This incident caused a small diplomatic conflict between the US and Singapore, but thereafter nobody dared to be arrogant or unruly in Singapore anymore. This also proved the effectiveness of strict punishment. To discuss about working ethics, with high salaries and high integrity, the corruption rate among employees is basically the lowest in the world. Because if you are corrupt, you will surely be at least physically punished until you can't bear it anymore. Through these 3 steps, Singapore's large restaurants became extremely popular among countries, make Singapore prosperous. But the leader of Singapore at that time, Lee Kuan Yew, had more than just that vision. All countries need to invest to Singapore was his bigger ambition. In British era, the British already brought advanced financial services to Singapore. At this time, Singaporean businessmen were advocating for free trade. Whatever anyone wanted to invest in was welcomed regardless. Even people who came to invest and open banks were warmly welcomed and kept confidential, even when the government didn't know where the money came from. As a result, Singapore received a lot of investments from all over the world. With money in hand, Singapore began researching new businesses. This was the time when China was reforming and opening up, and the oil industry was booming. An enormous amount of oil was being transported by China from the Middle East to East Asia, and the Malacca Strait had become a must-pass route. Singapore had become a crucial offshore oil transshipment station. Singapore started thinking how to benefit from this. The oil being transported from the other side was crude oil, so they had to stop in Singapore for a while to rest. Taking advantage of this break, Singapore would create supporting service to serve China transporters. At this point, Singapore had money. They invested to build oil and gas industrial zone. 8 oil refining companies were established, and now Singapore stood second, only after Houston in the US, as the largest oil refining centre. The third largest oil refining centre was Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. The output value reached 625 billion USD, becoming another pillar industry in Singapore. Through all these changes, Singapore was no longer the obedient daughter-in-law as before. But Singapore also had its drawbacks. Some say that Singapore is wearing the coat of democracy but is actually under a dictatorship regime. Asian have a joke that instead of calling it Singapore, you could call it Lee Gapor Haha because the largest ministry in Singapore is the Lee family. They own more than 1/3 of Singapore's assets. Therefore, you can say Singapore is the top destination for investment, but also a jail for their people. After all, Singapore's internal affairs is none of our business, for foreigners like us. We are just at most to be the tourists wandering around. It's better not to say anything more. Given the current international situation, we should only go there for tourism. Tourism in Singapore is truly not a bad choice. Fair saying, security in Singapore is super good. They speak English and Mandarin. But trust me, you have to be a bit careful here. If trash falls or if you throw a cigarette butt in the wrong place, your 1500 SGD might disappear. However, on the bright side, you can take back a souvenir. That's the fine bill from Singapore. If you're curious about Singapore's cane, then I wish you good luck. Thanks for staying at the end of the video. See you again with the next country. Bye.